Okay, so we are on week 7 of the Daniel Intensive. It's hard to believe that we're almost halfway through the 18 weeks that we're going to do. And that's good because we're about halfway through the book of Daniel. We're in chapter 6. There's 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. And tonight we're going to be talking about the salt and the light, what does that remind you of if you're thinking about salt and light? It reminds you of a song?
A song from VBS.
A song from VBS. Maybe it reminds you of the Sermon on the Mount, too, where Jesus says that you want to be salt and light. And that's where we're going to see the connection tonight, Daniel 6 to the Sermon on the Mount primarily. Okay, so we'll jump right in with an overview of Daniel 6, item 1 on the notes. Do you want to read the whole thing, or you want me and you to go back and forth, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, let's go back and forth.
Okay. I'll pretend to be Sam for a second. Yep.
I'll go first. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that how do you say this?
I think satraps is right.
Satraps might give account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God."
So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, "King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter." Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree.
Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. "Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" The king answered and said, "The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." So they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day.
And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed." So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Then a stone was brought and laid at the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him.
Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. Them, their children, and their wives in the dens overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den.
They were hungry lions. Verse 25, "Then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth. And on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Okay, now the theme of the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God over the kingdoms of men. I try to say this every week because it's important that we remember that, because there'll be moments in time in the future, if we lived through the time that Jesus described in the Olivet Discourse, if we live through the time that the book of Revelation describes, there'll be moments of time when the sovereignty of God over the kingdoms of men will be questioned in the hearts of believers, because the Antichrist is given authority to make war against the saints for 42 months. So we want to make sure that we know where to find information about the sovereignty of God over the kingdoms of men and the stories that highlight how it works so that we can agree with it. Now, in chapter 6, God demonstrates how to relate to the laws enacted by a pagan Gentile king when they impose on the sovereignty of God and the sanctity of man's relationship with him. Okay, so again, Daniel 6 is primarily about God's sovereignty over the laws that Gentile kings make that violate his sovereignty over his people and the sanctity of people's relationship with him. What that means is people's ability to worship him and their ability to be solely in relationship with him as God. Now, Daniel chapter 6 is a practical outline for how to deal with Revelation 13. Revelation 13 is one of the scarier chapters in the book of Revelation because it describes this authority of the Antichrist to make war on the saints, and also it describes a false Christian leader, a false prophet who rises up and deceives many and causes them to come into Antichrist worship. So we want to understand how to deal with Revelation 13. Daniel 6 is the answer for how to deal with Revelation 13. Okay, so Revelation 13, 11 through 18. Let's read this. This is the second part. So the first part of Revelation 13, just to jog your memory from when we've done Revelation studies, verses 1 through 10, they're talking about the first beast of the Antichrist. Verses 11 through 18, they're talking about the false prophet who causes the earth to worship the Antichrist. So the picture of the false prophet is like John the Baptist forerunning Jesus coming as the Messiah. John the Baptist pointed people to Jesus, and he said, the one coming after me is greater than I am. The false prophet is a false John the Baptist. He's a false Elijah. He's the spirit of Elijah was on John the Baptist. He's a false prophet who foreruns the Antichrist as the Messiah. Okay, so when we think about Daniel chapter 6, who would be the false prophets in Daniel chapter 6? What do you think? If, let's say Darius is a picture of the Antichrist, who would be the false prophets? And you can shout it out. We're small enough. The satraps and the governors, sure. Yeah, these people in governmental authority that are like, hey, King Darius, what if you were like God? We'll make a law so people will treat you like God. They're taking the role of the false prophets in this picture. Okay, so let's read Revelation 13, 11 to 18.
Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both great, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666.
Okay, so there's different aspects of Antichrist worship that are described in the book of Revelation, described in the Olivet Discourse when Jesus describes what to expect in the Great Tribulation, and described in the book of Daniel. Daniel kind of breaks down the different aspects of the abomination of desolation. Now remember, the abomination that causes desolation is the worship of an abominable thing that when God answers that, when he says, okay, if you want that reality to be your deity, I'll give it to you, and he removes his hand of restraint, what happens is desolation. It's the opposite of habitation. So when we worship God even tonight, we're inviting God to come and be sovereign over this place, and his promises to come and do that more and more. The more that we want him, the more we get ready to encounter him. It says in Psalm 24, who can ascend the hill of the Lord? He who has clean hands and a pure heart. So we're in this process of sanctification. He's in this process of coming. We want him. He wants us. And over time, in a process, he's returning. But there are places that are promised to not want him and will instead worship a man caused by deception. Much of it will be by deception. And God will give those places over to this man's ability, which is a complete failure because he's unable to actually be God. And that was the kind of the theme of the first few chapters of Daniel, were these kings that, Nebuchadnezzar sets up the gold plane on the statue of Dura, but then we see he has a dream and he's afraid. We see Belshazzar, he's bragging and drinking from the cups taken from the temple, and as soon as the handwriting happens, his knees are knocking and he's afraid. Those who assert that they're able to be God to the earth, they're not. They're just simply not, and their failure is the judgment for wanting them in the first place. Okay, so chapter 6 of Daniel, it shows us this aspect of Antichrist worship that's primarily rooted in provision. So what's the law? Let's actually go back to page 1. And the law is, let's see, verse 7. Let's read verse 7 one more time.
All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions.
So the law is you can't ask for anything from anyone except for King Darius for 30 days. This is talking about provision. It's actually talking about not just provision, but prayer. It's talking about needs, and it's related. So when we look at Revelation 13, the connection I'm trying to make is this abomination of desolation, this image that's created, it's tied to the mark of the beast, which is an economic system that is similar to the decree that Darius issues, which is you can't buy or sell anything unless you do it the end-time king's way, the Antichrist's way. If you try to buy or sell outside of it, you're breaking the law. And this will be a law. Okay, so when we look at Revelation 13, we see it says that he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many who had not worshiped the image of the beast to be killed. This will actually be by changes in the law. There'll be laws that say if you don't line up with what all of the world calls righteous and good, then you're a dissenter. You're a divider, and we're going to have to deal with you because you're breaking the unity that's in the earth right now. So let's turn for a second to Daniel 7, because I just want you to see this. I don't want you to take my word for the fact that it will be a law. I want you to see it in the Bible. Okay, so let's go to Daniel 7. Jen, if you could read. I got to find Daniel. You'd think that would be well worn at this point, but... Okay, Daniel. Did you yawn? Let's look at... Let's read verses 23 through 25, please, of Daniel 7.
Then he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it into pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall rise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings.
Now, this is talking about the Antichrist.
He shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change the times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time.
Excellent. So we know that one of his desires is to actually enact laws that most of the earth will see as righteous. Much of the falling away church will see as Christian. And so what we have to understand right now, what's happening in the church is a great division over truth. Like if we just look, it doesn't take a ton of searching to see that massive portions of the church are starting to disagree about kind of basic Bible truths about righteousness, about power, about sovereignty. And so as this is happening, we have to understand where this is going is that there's a promise in the Bible, a significant portion of the church will call good evil and evil good. And in Isaiah, it says, woe to those who call good evil and evil good in that day. And that's where we're going. And that's going to lead to a lot of confusion about what is righteous and what is real unity and what is real truth. And Daniel chapter 6 is actually highlighting the way that we avoid all of the trouble in getting confused in this and how God will protect people that avoid the trouble of getting confused in it. Because it's going to be very unpopular to resist a group of people that call themselves Christians that start supporting and then helping to enact, because false prophets will help false Christs enact bad laws, helping to enact laws that they're stamping as this is what everybody agreed on. Now, if we look, go back to page 1, these satraps and governors, they lie to Darius. They say, we all agreed. Well, they didn't all agree. We all, except for Daniel, would be the right way to say that. All of us satraps and governors, except for Daniel, we agreed that nobody should ask the king of anything except for you for 30 days. That's sneaky, right? And that's the way, actually, it says that the Antichrist comes to power by treachery and by deception. We'll get to that when we start studying Daniel 8, 9, 10, and 11. Sneaky, for sure. Okay. Yes. Thrown in the lion's den. Okay, so the primary subject matter of the book of Daniel is actually the abomination of desolation. And we're seeing all these different slices of how to deal with a false worship movement. So if we're paying attention over the last 6 weeks, that's really what we've been learning is, okay, this aspect of Antichrist worship, this is how you deal with it. This aspect, this is how you deal with it. And right now we're talking about when laws change that some people call righteous and say we all agreed, but they violate the sovereignty of God and the ability of man to worship the God of their choice, then there's something that we're supposed to do, okay? And there's actually something we're supposed to have been doing before that happens because we want to get ready for that. The satraps and the governors in Daniel 6, they functioned as false prophets, this is item D on page 2 of the notes, declaring the deity of Darius as a false Christ, as a false anointed one, able to provide for people. Okay, now Darius didn't realize that this was happening aligned against Daniel. He was, something in his heart thought this was a good idea, didn't connect it to the fact that his chief counselor was being cut off from him. This is a picture of the Antichrist. Like when we look at the way that Darius acted, I think typically we don't picture the Antichrist having a heart and like having friends and being like, oh no, I screwed up. Now I want to fix this and not being able to. But Darius is very clearly, according to the Bible, one of the 7 mountains and the 7 kings that is leading up to a full picture of who the Antichrist is. In fact, Darius is the bear of Revelation 13. Okay, so let's read Revelation 13, verse 2.
Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. Okay, so in this picture, when we connect this to the book of Daniel and history and the explanation of angels of the pictures that Daniel was getting in Daniel 7, Daniel 2, when Nebuchadnezzar has the dream, he sees the head of gold, the chest of iron, or of silver, and that's Darius. Darius is the chest. He represents the chest of silver, but also in Daniel 7, he represents the beast that comes out like a bear. Okay, now in this picture, the Darius part of the Antichrist beast. Okay, so remember, what was the Nebuchadnezzar part? The lion's, this is a quiz, the lion's mouth, right? The way that Nebuchadnezzar talked will mark the way that the Antichrist talks. The way that Darius established authority. So feet speaks of wherever you stand, you're occupying that space simply by your presence. The feet are talking about sovereignty and authority over an area or over the laws. So the Medes and the Persians were actually known for their lawmaking, and we'll get into that more in just a second. The Antichrist will take the same stands, authority, and judgments as Darius in some way, shape, or form. Now, like what that looks like, I don't know, but we can learn from reading the story. Like it's interesting to me that
Daniel in the lion's den, one of the primary examples of how to deal with one of the most feared aspects of the end times, has been reduced to a children's story. And like, we mostly tell it in kids' church. We almost never read it in adult church. And this is full of information of how to keep our families safe in a false worship culture that is clearly unfolding in the earth right now. Okay, so when we look at the way that the Antichrist will take the same stands, authority, and judgments as Darius, feet speak of possession by authority. You possess the ground you stand on, is the example that I gave. The Medes and the Persians were known for their legal system. This is item G on page 3 of the notes. And particularly for their irrevocable laws. And this is why the Persians, they believed that a king was directly inspired by the false god Ahura Mazda, which is it's the false Iranian deity. If you go back to this time, to the time of the Achaemenid empires, the primary deity of Zoroastrianism. So there was a guy named Zoroaster who got a vision from a demon and encountered what he thought was an angel, and the angel presented him to this god, this false god, Ahura Mazda, and that's where maybe you remember from grade school hearing about Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster was the prophet to the false god Ahura Mazda. Okay, so his name Ahura Mazda means mighty Lord of wisdom. And so because of this, because he was considered to be the creator and he had perfect wisdom, because the king was receiving divine revelation as he made edicts according to Persian tradition, it was considered that there could be no flaw in the edict, that this false god Ahura Mazda, because he was the embodiment of wisdom, if he told a king something, it had to be the wisdom itself and could not be changed. So Persian edicts were considered infallible because of the wisdom of this Iranian deity. Now, this is ironic in light of Darius realizing that he'd been duped into making a law against his most helpful counselor. Like, clearly in the first part of the chapter, Daniel's shown as being like the most helpful, wisest counselor, and listening to this false god, his laws, led Darius to be like, oh no, I've just cut off the one wise guy I've got. Okay, now, item 2, faith in action. This is the most important part of what we're going to talk about tonight, in my opinion, because when I started to grab a hold of this clear picture in the Bible, it unlocked a bunch of different Bible passages to me all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament to kind of understand what it was pointing to. So, Lord, I just pray that right now, that you just open our hearts, help us to see wondrous things in your word and in your law, in Jesus' name. There's a process of faith in action that we're looking at here in Daniel 6, and it's not readily apparent until you see it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. There's a process of faith in action that's seen over and over in the Bible. We see it in many stories, and related to this is in Hebrews 11, this litany of faith. If you've ever, I think most of us are probably familiar with Hebrews 11, talking about faith, and then all the patriarchs of the faith. Almost all of those people mentioned, they walk through the same process that we're going to walk through here right now. And once you see it, if you try to find these realities in their stories, it will really open up what's happening and why God did some of the things that he did. So let's read Hebrews 11:6.
But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.
Okay, so without faith, it is impossible to please God. That means without believing some things that aren't yet, we can't really please God. We have to believe that he's leading us in a process where if we say yes to that process, he will reward us, but the reward is not apparent on the front end. So a lot of times you see this when trying to hear God. When we talk to kids sometimes about hearing God, this is something that comes up, is like, well, I try to hear God, but I don't hear anything. Maybe he doesn't want to talk to me. Well, that kind of circumvents the whole process of hearing God, which is by faith. We hear him by faith. So we have to kind of stay in it, believing he wants to hear us in order to get to the point where we actually start to hear him. And then we grow in that relationship. That's true of everything. It's true of generosity. Like, you think about the first time that you tithe. You tithe like, well, it's in the word. I believe this pleases God. I'm not really sure how this works. I'm going to give some of my wealth away, some of my resource away. And over time, the more you do it, the more you see, oh, like, this frees my heart. It gets me in a deeper connection with God. It actually touches my resources. It blesses me. It blesses people around me. Oh, the economy of God actually works. But it takes some faith to get to there. Same thing with forgiveness. Forgiveness is one of the main things, actually. If you're married, you know this. I mean, we know this. Like, when we first got married, we'd get in a fight, And neither one of us wanted to be the first one to say we're sorry or that we forgave the other one, because we've got something in our stable now that is helpful. If we get wronged in the future, we can kind of match that with what we've got, and that will keep us in a good tension of like nobody winning. And that's really what happens. Nobody wins that way. So forgiveness, when we start to get into, okay, it's worth it on the front end in faith to forgive, because the more that I do that, the more I find out I get forgiven, and the more our relationship is able to grow. Does that make sense? But it takes faith to get there. You're never going to get there thinking it out, because it doesn't make any sense until you realize that we're living in a matrix, like a false culture that's mostly fed by bad information, and God has a kingdom that lives in an entirely different value system. And when I tap into that different value system, just believing that it works, I get the benefits of that value system, and I start to live in a supernatural condition, even though it's naturally supernatural. It's not like, it's not shining or causing fire with my finger. I'm just living in a reality where forgiveness happens easier, resources are less scary, and, all the Sermon on the Mount realities are starting to manifest. And that's really the point. God, what's supernatural to us is only supernatural to us because God is withdrawn. When he comes back, like supernatural is just natural, and he likes natural. He's not looking for everything to be a display of signs that takes our faith away and just gives us eyesight. Like, that doesn't work like that. He actually likes us believing he's good. That was the problem in Genesis 3 at the fall. Adam and Eve, he's absent for a minute. Satan lies about him, and they start believing he's not good. Like, this is the way that the fall happened, and it's the way that the renewal happens. It happens subtly and naturally, and it's supernatural, but it's also natural. Does that make sense? Okay, so the process of faith, I define it like this. Item B on page 3 of the notes. First part, ascension or sanctification. What does ascension mean? Jay, do you know what ascension means? Going up. So the first part is like going up. Daniel, in Daniel 6, he goes up to the upstairs room that he's praying in. All over the Bible, you will find people that encounter God physically walk up in elevation. All over the Bible. Once you start to look for it, it will unlock your heart to see faith in action. Until I saw this, it's like, why are people going up on mountains, and what is this about being down low, and like, what does it matter? But when you start to see it, you can't unsee it. It's like one of those things. It's like, oh, this is connected to this other time somebody went up, and it's really about sanctification. It's got, in my opinion, not a ton to do with elevation. Like, I don't think at 600 foot sea level you get less encounter with God than 1,000 foot sea level. It's talking about getting away from the din of the culture. Like what everybody else is kind of caught up in, looking down on, looking sideways, afraid of. It's like Jesus said, when you see all these things, lift your head, okay? It's like getting as high as you can. Now, the next part is when you do that, when you ascend or sanctify, you get revelation. When you just clear out the junk, you see more of God. It's guaranteed. He wants us to see him in full. He says, no man can see me and live, but he's giving us new bodies that will be capable of being face to face with him. That's actually, we're working out our salvation to get a capacity to actually see him and hear him. So that means that we exercise the muscle of these things now so that we have an ability later. Now, the next thing that happens when you get revelation, you get authority to carry out revelation. We might call that grace. Grace is like the power to do the thing God wants you to do. Grace is not, hey, you can just kind of live against the leadership of God and still be okay. That's false grace. Real grace is you can keep trying to do the thing God wants you to do, and he'll empower you to do it. So when you get revelation and you say yes to it, you start to get authority to carry out that revelation. That's awesome, but it also comes with some strings attached, some consequences. Because when you start to walk in your authority, you will do things that are uncommon. We call those works. Those works will result in rejection and persecution. Guaranteed. If you're doing the works of Jesus, you will be persecuted. You do no works, you won't get persecuted, but you also will have no inheritance. Vindication is the next part. If you get persecuted for doing right, you will be vindicated, and God will be glorified by your good works that you do. This is the only way that the sanctification process works. There's no other sanctification laid out in the Bible. If you're not getting some persecution for sanctifying, for ascending, then you're not actually doing it. It's just the plain basic truth. Now, we get it in very small measures, the persecution and the sanctification. intentionally, step by step. We follow the Lord because he gives us what we can bear. And that's what it says in Matthew 16, or in John 16, when Jesus tells the promise of the Spirit coming at the Last Supper. He says, I'm going away, but that's good for you because I'm going to send the Spirit to you, and he's going to lead you into all truth. He'll teach you things as you can bear them. So I say yes to sanctification. I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to come up as much as I can. Lord, I want to see you. And then I see something, and it's probably going to be kind of small, some small revelation. And he's like, do something with it. Like, say it or live into it or try it. Maybe he shows me, I want you to be more generous. Okay. And then he puts somebody in my life who needs, $50, and I know they're going to waste it. I know they're not going to use it well. But he's like, no, this is about you. This is about you responding to the revelation I gave you. I do that work. And then I get authority to do it. I do the work. There's going to be some persecution that comes with it. Maybe the person doesn't appreciate it. Maybe they misunderstand why I gave it to them. It's all like these small things. But over time, if you keep doing it, the works will grow, the ascending will grow, the encounters will grow, and the persecution will grow. And this is how we get glorified in the end. Now, Daniel chapter 6 is a picture of faith in action in the context of forced Antichrist worship, which is going to be the ultimate test of sanctification. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and that false worship. Remember in Daniel chapter 3, we see Nebuchadnezzar sets up the statue on the plain of Dura. Those guys were suddenly sanctified. They were set apart from the whole rest of the crowd. Everybody else bows down. They're standing up. That's one of the ultimate tests of sanctification is, will you stand against a crowd of your peers when they're all like, dude, this is what we're all doing right now. Hebrews 11, 32 to 33. Now, the reason I threw this in here is because Daniel stopping the mouth of lions, it was by faith, and this is the way faith works, this 1 through 6 process.
And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions.
Now, the only story we get in the Bible of stopping the mouth of lions is the prophet Daniel. So we see that in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews is actually relating this idea. What Daniel did, the mouths of lions were stopped by faith. Okay, and the testimony of Daniel itself says this. So let's go back to Daniel chapter 6. And let's go to verse 19. Yeah, let's read verses 19 through 22 again.
Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, so that they would not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you.
Keep going.
Now
yeah.
the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that he should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God.
Okay, so no injury was found on him. Why? Because he believed in his God. It was actually faith that kept him safe. And he says, I was persecuted even though I didn't do anything wrong. I was persecuted simply for staying loyal to Jesus. Okay, and this is important because if you're persecuted for breaking the law, that's different. That's not sanctification. That's not the process that God uses to vindicate his sovereignty over the kingdoms of men. God is looking to be glorified so that people can be saved. When God is glorified, Jesus said, when the Son of Man is lifted up, many will be gathered unto him. When people operate in faith, what it does is their good works, they glorify God, and then many people get saved. God, his desire is that none should perish. What Daniel was doing was giving a witness to Darius and to the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians that God is sovereign and that if you turn to him, he will protect. In fact, that's Darius's testimony, which is very similar to Nebuchadnezzar's testimony at the end of the Nebuchadnezzar's encounters with Daniel, and Daniel revealing, the power of God in the way that he treated Nebuchadnezzar, and then here, the way that he was dealing with Darius. Okay, so let's go back to page 3 of the notes. If we pursue our faith rightly, item D on page 3, it will produce good works. without good works, we're really not walking in faith. Now, we're not saved by good works. Good works don't save us. What they do is they glorify the one who's saving us. Okay? So they're essential. If we care about the glorification of God, works are essential. Without works, there's no glorification of God on the earth. There's no witness. So what we want to do is have a faith that is continually producing more and more works that glorify God in front of people. Like, it has to be demonstrated in front of people I'll show you the passage. It's not, you don't have to take my word for that. Okay, so if we pursue our faith rightly, it will produce good works. These good works will glorify God, but they'll anger those opposed to his sovereignty. So when we do the works of God, it glorifies God, but it also makes people mad who are trying to keep power in a Gentile kingdom system and Gentile kingdom values. Because God's way of doing things, it upsets Gentile authority. It actually takes people, like, takes unimportant people and makes them important. And the authority structures of the earth, the power structures of man, they want man to earn power because that keeps the whole system stable and people in line. That's not the way God does it. God produces authority by revelation. People who want him get him, and he's powerful. So when you get him, he brings you into a partnership to do powerful things with him. Because we're not supposed to be workers, we're supposed to be sons. Does that make sense? In the pyramid schemes of man, they want a lot of workers to keep the base solid. In the family kingdom of God, he wants sons to share freely all that he has with them. It's an entirely different value system. And when you start operating in the kingdom value system, you're going to find there are false people all around you. They really value Gentile authority. They actually value, hey, you didn't earn that. It's not time for you to move up yet. Who are you to tell me? That's a false Gentile authority system, but it's also in the church. It's with religious people. It's in governmental systems everywhere. And what God wants to do is not have us tear those things down by force. He wants us to be shining lamps that, agreeing with him, you can come against me, but you're not going to defeat him. You're fighting against God. Remember, that's what the Pharisees said when they're trying to eradicate the disciples. And one of the Pharisees says, you know what? Remember when this happened before? We could actually find ourselves fighting against God. Let's not do this. They didn't listen. You know, the Sadducees and Pharisees, the high priests, they didn't listen. Okay, so let's read a few passages right in a row because I want to highlight this idea of what faith does in this idea of ascension, then revelation, authority, works, rejection, and glorification. Okay, so I'm going to cover all these in just like 5 passages. So, Jen, if you just don't mind reading them right in a row here. James 2:18.
But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.
Okay, so the basic biblical principle is that we demonstrate our faith by what it produces, the fruit it produces. Jesus says in John 15, unless you abide in the vine, you can bear no fruit. The fruit is the good works. If you're not bearing fruit, you're really not abiding in the vine. You're really not living. You could say, I believe I'm connected, but if a branch out laying on the ground was like, I believe I'm connected to that tree, but there's no leaves coming out in the spring, there's no, nothing growing on it, would be like, well, you could say you're connected, but you're clearly not. Okay? Exodus 3:1-2.
Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed.
Now this is a story of Moses ascending. When he gets to the Mount of Horeb, when you look, it says that they're actually up on the mountain if you go a little further in the passage. So he ascends Mount Horeb, and then he sees something. There's revelation there. This bush is on fire, but it's still alive. The bush starts talking to him, and the bush tells him to go do something, and then he goes in authority to do that thing. Now, this wasn't the first inkling that Moses had about delivering Israel. If you remember the story of Moses, his first inkling was when he killed the Egyptian. And he was doing that without revelation and without authority. He knew his calling. He knew he was called to deliver Israel from Egypt, but he was doing it without any revelation or anointing or authority. And what he did was he broke the law. He killed an Egyptian, covered him up in the sand. He thought nobody would find out about it. People found out about it. He ran away, and for 40 years, he was absent Egypt. But then he does it in the process of faith. He sees this burning bush. He's like, I'm going to go up. I'll see what this is about. He goes up. He encounters revelation by the angel of the Lord. And then in the authority of God, he goes back to Egypt. Now, what does he do when he gets back to Egypt? Does he, like, in the strength of man, he's like, okay, I'm going to find like 10 guys. We'll form a group. I'll kind of politic among the Israelites for a couple of months. I'll get them to elect me leader, and then I'll kind of roll out this plan. No, he just tells them what God told him to tell him. That's crazy. He goes to the elders of Israel, and he says, I talked to a bush in the desert. What was the bush's name? I am. I am. Told you to come and that you're going to deliver us? Yes. But it worked. There was authority in the revelation he had. He tried it the first time without authority, without a revelation, but then he ascended. He sanctified himself. He was out by himself in the desert, like David, the shepherd out in the desert. If you start to look, you'll see the people who carry revelation and authority, they spend moments ascending, or they spend moments off away from the culture and what everybody else is doing. This is the same picture that we get of the disciples in the upper room for the 10 days, that they're waiting for the fire to fall and the wind to blow. They ascend into the upper room. They wait. They encounter something, and then that encounter fills them with revelation and authority. They start healing everybody. I mean, they've got power on their ministry. Okay, let's read Hebrews 11:27-28, talking of Moses' faith.
By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them.
So what the writer of Hebrews is telling us is that this story of the Exodus, it's all about faith, and the story of the Exodus is actually about ascension, revelation, authority, works, rejection. Moses was one of the most rejected people you'll find in the Bible. He was rejected by everybody. He was rejected by Pharaoh. He was rejected by his own family, Miriam and Aaron. He was rejected by the leaders of Israel. He was rejected by the millions of the multitude that came out of Egypt. They're like, you brought us out here to die. He was rejected by everybody because he was as God to the people. People don't like God. We really don't like God, believe it or not. That's where repentance comes in. We start to realize, if I was in the time of Jeremiah, I'd probably be one of the people that didn't like Jeremiah very much. That's what Jesus said. He's like, you build tombs to the prophets, but you would have killed them in their day. You really don't like God. You just like God when he's not dealing with you. When God's dealing with you, you don't like him that much. He angers you. He annoys you. He doesn't make sense to you. You think his ways are evil. You think your ways are good. People don't like God. That's the whole point of repentance. That's why John the Baptist, the real prophet that came before Jesus, was like, repent, the kingdom is at hand. Start to learn to like God. It'll take some time. It takes time to learn to like God. Okay, so page 4 of the notes. Acts 7, verse 35. Now, this is the testimony of Moses' rejection, one of them.
This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. Okay,
so that way we over and over the Bible tells us what made Moses the deliverer was talking to the burning bush, the angel of the Lord appearing to him in the burning bush. It was this revelatory encounter. It changed who he was. Revelation will always do this. If you see God, you have to respond to what he shows you. Otherwise, you're going backwards. Now, Moses, he ascended, item E on page 4 of the notes. He ascended the mountain God led him to. He was given an assignment to reconcile and deliver. In the burning bush revelation, Moses was given authority to carry out his assignment. Now, Moses, walking in obedience to the revelation and authority that encounter produced, it became a progression that cost Moses a bunch of relationships. So Moses, he persevered in the rejection and persecution by his brethren, Pharaoh, the sons of Korah. They were the priests. Aaron and Miriam, the entire Jewish remnant led out of Egypt on numerous occasions. He got rejected by everybody over and over again. Now, Moses' perseverance in public to this rejection, if you study it out, you'll see Moses, he didn't try to hide the rejection. He just said, hey, God is the one who called me this. He'll deal with you. God dealt with all of these people rebelling against him many times. The sons of Korah swallowed up by the earth. Miriam got leprosy, cast out of the camp for 7 days. Like everybody who rejected God's authority operating through Moses, they had to pay the price for that. Moses' perseverance in public led to a testimony that glorified God through the good works of Moses. Your works will go with you. forever. You will be rewarded for your works. The Bible says that the fire will test everybody's work. If you build on the foundation of Christ, that there's coming a time of testing, and if what you are building survives, then you'll be rewarded. Some people will come through the time of testing with nothing, as if through a fire, it says. They'll have nothing to show for it because they didn't take any time to connect their faith to risking their reputation and their resources and their dreams by stretching into the leadership of God. But this is the only way faith works. The way that it starts, though, is with ascension. Okay, so everybody say ascension. Moses ascended, over and over, stories of ascension in the Bible. Now, this is Moses' perseverance that led to the good works that glorified God. Again, works don't save us. They glorify the one who saves us. This is what it means to be salt and light. To be salt and light means that you're making a difference in a place that is bland, dull, rotten, cold, and frozen. And light changes darkness into something where people can see. That's what it means to be salt and light, is you stand in the revelation authority in the sanctified place, and you just say what God told you to say, and you do what God told you to do. If you'll do that, people will come against you and try to get you to stop doing that, because Gentile authority hates it, because God is coming to remove all Gentile authority. Remember, that's the point of the book of Daniel. That's what we learned about in Daniel 2, was that stone cut out without human hands, it's going to crush every Gentile empire and turn it to dust. So if you believe in the Gentile value system of power, if you believe that might makes right, then what you are is afraid of anybody that carries revelation and suddenly becomes somebody because they heard God. That scares the junk out of people that don't believe in that authority system. Does that make sense? And that's what you're called to do. If you're not doing that, you're really not operating in faith. We're really supposed to be earth changers. Now, we change starting from the inside out. First, we have to be us changers. And then, if we do that, that fire grows and we start to change the people around us. So Jesus lays all this out in the Sermon on the Mount. And then we're going to read that right now, Matthew 5, 9-16, the last part of the Beatitudes, into the point of it. But we have to remember, when Jesus said this, it was one of the first references to a multitude following Jesus. The first time Jesus got a multitude of people following, he started sifting them immediately. And he started telling them very hard truths to find out who actually wanted to be counted with him. And he was going to be counted a criminal, because he's coming to change all the kingdoms of the earth. So let's read Matthew 5, 9-16.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs shall be the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
Okay, so this is gospel 101. This is the only way the gospel works. But we have to understand that Daniel is living this out. In fact, he's one of the prophets. It says in verse 12, so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. When he says, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, when you're persecuted and they say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Now, if you're breaking laws, if you're not obeying proper authority, and people accuse you and put you in jail, or you take the punishment, there's no righteousness in that. It's when you're doing the right thing and people falsely accuse you. That's when this is working in your life. Now, Daniel, he's one of these prophets who were persecuted before you. And if we look, this is what Daniel did. He had an opportunity in Daniel 6. When he hears about this law, he had an opportunity to become unsalty right then. He's salty. He's messing things up. The other guys are like, he tastes a little different than we do. He's acting a little different. He's a little more powerful than we are. And we're afraid of him. He's taking our authority away. And if you look, one of their main accusations is he's one of the captives from Judah. He's a Jew. This is happening right now. Anti-Semitism is all throughout history, and it's coming back in en masse right now. We don't want it. It's going to come against Christians as well. He's a Christian. That's why it's happening, because he's a Christian. Now, many will shrink back when that starts to happen. In fact, many shrink back right now. If anybody, anything controversial comes up, somebody's saying something true and it's controversial, we're tempted to just kind of be like, I'll just kind of stand over here for a second until that passes. I hope that doesn't happen to me. But that's not the way that Daniel did things. Daniel stayed salty. He stayed light. When he heard this decree, he went to the very place of accusation, right? Because they're like, no one can ask or pray anything. And what does it say? When he heard that the law had been signed, he immediately went to the place that was illegal, because he was not going to back down from the sovereignty of God over Gentile kingdoms. There's a place where authority oversteps the line. All authority is given by God, but there's a place where it oversteps the line and tries to become God. When that happens, we are obligated to resist it. And you'll see that throughout the Bible. But until that happens, we're obligated to obey the law, right? So I'll show you these passages. You don't have to take my word for that. Okay, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus ascended a hill, and then he taught us the process of faith to ascend with him in the weight of all that comes with that revelation. Okay, that's what he was really doing. When he climbed up that hill, the multitudes were following him. He started to separate people. He sanctified himself so that others could be sanctified. That's what it says in John 17. He climbed up a hill so that anyone who wanted to climb up there with him could, and he told them how in the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are like 8 steps up to the place of the cross, to persecution. And he said, if you'll do that, they persecute you for being mine. What is going to happen is I'll keep you in that somehow, and you will be salt and light if you'll trust me in this process. Now, some people are martyred. They really are. But most aren't. Most are witnesses of his glory. John is a great example of this, John the Beloved. Some of the disciples were martyred. They tried to martyr John according to historical records. They couldn't kill him, so they exiled him to the island of Patmos. And what did he get on the Isle of Patmos? Revelation. That's what happens when you ascend and sanctify and you trust God to be salt and light. You become light. Like that book of Revelation is light to the end time generation. The bride is going to come forward. But it's only going to happen is the more people do it. The reason the bride comes forward, what did Jesus say? How did he say the kingdom would come? Did he say, okay, I'm just waiting for the moment when I'm going to split the sky and the New Jerusalem is going to come down? No. He said the kingdom, this is in Luke 17, the kingdom is going to come from within you. There's coming a day when you'll desire to see the days of the Son of Man, but you have to know that first a bride is going to emerge. The falling away has to happen first. The man of sin has to be revealed. The bride has to come forward. And the bride is only going to come forward as more and more people see the light in the salt and make a choice in that to do the same thing, to stand. That's the problem right now. Almost no one will stand for truth. A lot of people believe truth. A lot of people see it. But the cost for the relational cost for standing for truth is so great, most people will just kind of try to sit quietly and hope it goes away, but it's not going away. It's getting worse and worse and worse. But there's going to come a breaking point where many will start to stand. In fact, turn with me for a second to Daniel 12. What is that breaking point? Do you guys know? It's when the abomination of desolation is set up in the holy place, when the image is set up. Daniel 12, let's read verses 1 through 4.
At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament and run, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase.
We live in this time. We live in the time the bride is going to come forward because people, by the connection of communication, will start to see that standing silent in the face of great evil is increasing evil, and they'll stand. Now, others, when people run to and fro and knowledge increases, they'll fall into delusion. They'll fall into Babylonian unity. They'll think, we got to get together and fix this thing. But there are some, the wise, that will lead many in righteousness, and they will say, no, Jesus is the one who's going to bring peace. Right now, there's massive cries in the earth about, oh, this is peace. Somebody's going to make peace in North Korea. Somebody's going to make peace in Iran. Somebody's going to make peace in the Middle East, in Israel. These are all false peace. There will not be any peace until the Prince of Peace comes back, clearly by the Bible. He will not give his glory to another. And he has said over and over, I will be the one that makes Jerusalem a praise of the nations. And he's going to do that sovereignly when Israel invites him back, according to Psalm 118. So we have to understand that all of this is pointing to the separation of the church, the coming of a bride coming up, and the release of a harlot that will become unsalty in the face of persecution, in the face of Antichrist worship. She'll just go along to get along. And she'll say, we'll sort it out later. God doesn't want me to ruin this chance at power. God doesn't want me to ruin this chance at authority. And what they'll find is they become unsalty and they're worth nothing but to be trampled underfoot. And they will be trampled underfoot. This is actually what happened if you look to the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Jesus' day. They're like, we have no king but Caesar. That went directly against every Hebrew law to say we have no king but Caesar. And when they did that, they got Caesar and they got trampled underfoot. They became unsalty. We don't want that to happen. So we can learn from the way that Daniel stood how to get ready to stand. And that's what we're about to get into right now. Okay, so Daniel, he was an ascender. Remember Jesus, he went up on the Sermon on the Mount. We're on page 4 of the notes, item L. Daniel was an ascender. He just got with God. He went as high as he could towards God. He focused on the thing God cared about. And he got revelation. He got wisdom and authority. And that actually led him to do many good works in Babylon and in the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians. People hated him for it, tried to kill him, but he was always vindicated in this process. This is a picture for us, okay? So let's read Psalm 24, 3-7 about ascending.
Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This is Jacob, the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face. Lift up your heads, O you gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in.
Now, the key verse in Daniel 6 is Daniel 6:10. Okay, and I printed it here below in the bottom of page 4 of the notes, because in Daniel 6:10, we see, why Daniel received authority in the first place. We see the accusation against him is based on the jealousy for this authority and an attempt to stop the authority from happening. And we see that Daniel 6:10 has the sovereign answer to the accusation. So it's how Daniel got power. It's what the people tried to stop Daniel from doing to take away his power. And doing it, continuing to do it, was what kept him safe in the attempt to stop him from having this power. Isn't that crazy? It's all in Daniel 6:10. Now, will you read that one more time?
Yeah. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days.
This is what he always did. This is what you want to always do so that you're ready for the moment that you're told you can't do it. If you're like, I agree with house of prayer. I agree. Hey, asking and receiving, that works. I'm going to do it when things get real bad. I'm going to spend more time doing it when things get real bad. You actually won't, because what the real bad is going to be a massive attempt to get you to stop doing it. So you got to be in the habit of doing it already so that when the accusation comes, you're already convinced that it works. If you're like, that's going to be my plan when I really need it, but for now I'm just going to kind of keep doing normal until I need to respond. If you do that, you will not stand. Clearly, this is what Peter did going into the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is like, Peter, you're going to be made to stumble tonight. Peter's like, I'm good. I won't deny you. I'm even ready to die for you. Jesus is like, watch and pray with me. Because what Peter needed to do was watch and pray. That's what he's going to need to do. When Jesus is getting arrested, he's supposed to be watching and praying. But instead, Peter wouldn't do that. He fell asleep. He's like, I'll do whatever I need to do when I need to do it. And then when Jesus gets arrested, Peter does all the wrong things because it's not in his muscle memory to do the one thing that would help him stand. And he becomes very unsalty in that moment, right? Because he denies he even knows Jesus. And he's really only fit to be trampled underfoot. Now, it's the grace of God that he used Peter to be the rock on which the church was built. But Peter hadn't received the Holy Spirit yet. When he denied Jesus, he had not received the Spirit. And Hebrews 6 tells us, once you receive the Spirit, to deny the Lord is to crucify him all over again. There is no atonement for that sin. So we are supposed to look at Peter's example and say, okay, I don't want to make the same mistakes. That's not grace. There's no grace to do the same thing that Peter did. There's grace to not do what Peter did. Does that make sense? There's grace to obey Jesus in that. Okay, page 5 of the notes. We're going to take about 3 more minutes, and we're going to leave the rest of this undone tonight. Now, Daniel, he was in the habit of being set apart in time spent with God, which gained him revelation and authority. Daniel received his excellent spirit. The whole accusation came from the fact that he had an excellent spirit, and Darius preferred him. That whole excellent spirit, it came through sanctification. Let's read Daniel 6:3.
Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm.
Okay, and then let's read Daniel 1:15-21. We find out where he got this excellent spirit. Now, as we read this, I want you to think about the 10 days that we're about to start here at Light Hop, because the 10 days is a theme throughout the Bible connected to ascending. The disciples, they ascended to the upper room for 10 days. Daniel and his friends in Daniel 1, they are sanctified and tested for 10 days. 10 days is the testing of the sanctification process. And then it's answered with revelation and authority and then persecution, always. Okay, so let's read Daniel 1:15-21 with this in mind.
And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portions of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. In all the matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus.
Now the disciples of Jesus, they did the same thing, and they received revelation, authority, persecution, and vindication. We read about this in Acts 1 and 2. Okay, so I give you Acts 1 where it says they went up into the upper room, and then item Q, 10 days later. 10 days is the time of testing and sanctification. You'll find that in Daniel 1:18, which we just read, but also in Revelation 2:10, when Jesus addresses the church at Smyrna. He says, you're under persecution right now. You're being killed because of your faithfulness to my name. You're sanctified. There's a synagogue of Satan. They lie about who you are. He says, you'll get tribulation 10 days. Do not quit. I'll give you the crown of life. This 10 days, it's about being in the process of sanctification, testing it, waiting in it, so that you can get the revelation and authority you need to go forward. That's Jesus, when he gave the Great Commission, he said, tarry in the city until power comes from on high. They didn't know it was going to be 10 days. It just was 10 days. Okay, now Acts 2:1-4, let's read this real fast, because I think there's an important point in Acts 2 that a lot of times we miss about the fire and what it was for.
When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven, as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance.
Now, I think a lot of times when we picture the fire falling or the tongues of fire that were resting on the heads of the believers, we tend to imagine that like, oh, that was a sign to people like that would see that. But it says that the fire appeared to them. This was a revelation to those people, the people that got the fire. Does that make sense? They're waiting. They're just like Moses encountering the burning bush. Moses, he goes up to see what's going on. He ascends. He encounters the burning bush. The angel of the Lord tells him through the appearance of the burning bush what he's supposed to do, and then he has authority to go do that. In the upper room in Acts 2, the flames of fire, it appeared to them, to the ones that were waiting. It was a sign. It was a revelation to them, and they got authority in that. Okay, the Holy Spirit started to teach them how to speak to the 17 different nations that were in Jerusalem that day. They didn't know how to speak all these languages. Okay, but what did those disciples get when we read later in Acts 4, Acts 5? Persecution. And what does Peter say when they say, stop talking about Jesus? He says, is it better for us to listen to God or to man? And they kept preaching Jesus because the false authority, the human authority was trying to supersede God's authority. And God is like, you can't cross that line. They need to listen to the high priest until the high priest says, you can't speak of Jesus. Then they got to say, I got to speak of Jesus. You're trying to cut off the very thing Jesus is doing. Like, I won't stop doing that. but I will obey your laws. I'll do it as much as I can in the authority that I'm under. But that's the one thing I won't do. I will not violate the sovereignty of God over the kingdoms of men or my right to worship him. Okay, Elena, if you could come back up. There's a lot more here in the notes. I don't know. We'll probably pick some of this up. Mostly what's left is how to apply this to Revelation 13. So if you're interested in that, I suggest that you take a look at it. I'm going to read from page 7 of the notes, John 17, 4 to 21. And if I just want to pray for you. If you don't mind standing with me while I read this. This is what Jesus promised his disciples. He promised it not just to his first disciples, but to everyone who would believe because they took a stand, because they stayed salty. There's this promise, just like Abraham coming out of Ur of the Chaldees. You know, and God says to him, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And then Abraham walks out this life of faith. Like he has this encounter, you know, and it gives him authority. But it's like a process. He's walking it out over time. Well, Jesus says something very similar to the disciples in the upper room. Really, before they go to the upper room to pray for 10 days, they're in the upper room with him at the Last Supper. And he says to them, I'm not just praying for you. I'm praying for everyone who will believe in me because you stay salty. This is what he said. John 17, verse 14. I've given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have also sent them into the world. And for their sakes, I sanctify myself, that they also may be sanctified by the truth. He's saying, I set myself apart. I came to the earth so that they could come to heaven. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. What this will produce when people start to stand and stay salty, and it starts small, it will produce a unified bride. This is the only unity the Bible describes. It's unity, not us agreeing with each other about Jesus, us agreeing with Jesus about each other. That you're worth, like Paula, that you're worth it for me to stand in the persecution. It's worth it because your life will be impacted by it. And if I become unsalty, it's harder for you to stay salty. It's very hard for one person to stand. It's a little bit easier for 2 to stand. It's a little bit easier for 3 to stand. It's a whole lot easier for 5, 10, 20, 100, thousands to stand together. That's the way this is going to work. The kingdom is coming from the inside. So if you want that, if you just want to see the areas of your life where God's calling you to revelation, to authority, and then to stand as the kingdoms of men resist that authority, I just want to pray for you. We're just going to ask God. That's what Daniel did 3 times a day. So if you want that, just respond to him like, I don't know, raise your hand or tell him with your own words. It's probably the best way to do it. Jesus, I'm asking, would you show us, Lord, where you're calling us to stand? Will you show us, Lord, the value of just getting in the practice of ascending, just sanctifying ourselves, getting into a place where it's us and you, spending time trying to see God, trying to hear God, and then obeying when you tell us what seems sometimes like small things to do. Would you show us how it's giving us muscle memory to stand, that's loving the people around us, that loving you with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength will overflow into loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. Lord, would you show us that you're not looking for dead works that aren't connected to faith, but you're looking for faith that will produce works. Would you show us the minute difference in that, Lord? Would you show us that your ways are above our ways? I'm asking all over this room, would you release fire? Lord? Would you release salt and fire? Not so people will see it on us, but so we'll see it. So we'll see it, Lord. We'll encounter you in revelation, that you'll give us authority to walk out what you're calling us to walk out. Lord, I'm asking for zeal in our connection to you. I'm asking for zeal, that when we open the word, when we open our hearts to talk to you, we encounter you. And that it stirs up a hunger and I'm asking for a hunger and a thirst for righteousness to sweep through us, Lord. I pray that this week is different because we just ascend a little bit more. And I just hear the Lord saying, if you just tell me I want more of you, that's the first step in ascending. It's spiritual poverty. It's saying, I don't have enough of you. If you just tell him about your poverty, he will meet it. If you mourn it, he will comfort you in it. He will give you a hunger and a thirst for righteousness. He will make you merciful. He will give you a pure heart. You will see God. You will be a peacemaker, and you will get persecuted, but you'll be ready to stand. So, Lord, I'm asking that process of the Beatitudes, pour it out in this room. In Jesus' name, amen.